We're here to talk about questions of race and ethnicity. And I think where I'd like to start is with one of the classic texts on race and ethnicity in the United States. W.E.B. DuBois's The Souls of Black Folks. The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, a book I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you've not read the book, you've certainly heard one of the most famous lines from it, which is Du Bois noting in 1903 that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, which was going to prove to be sadly accurate. In the first chapter of Du Bois's book, he begins by forthrightly confronting the problem and how it is constructed. He says, "Between me and the other world there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter round it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought at Mechanicsville,' or 'Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem, I seldom answer a word. And yet, being a problem is a strange experience." So Du Bois is talking about how in the world he lived in, he, as a black person, was seen as a problem. Not a person with problems, as we all are persons with problems, but as part of a people who themselves are a problem. Now that's in the language of 1903. If you update those questions, you might have statements that white people might make to black people, such as, "Isn't that Obama something?" Or, "Don't those right-wing talk show hosts make your blood boil?" But still, there is this question, how does it feel to be a problem, that I think we have to deal with. So what we want to do today is look at that question, to recognize that a century ago the United States was haunted by that question, and I think one can argue today, a century later, the United States is still haunted by what is often described as the race problem. And what I want to do is think through the nature of that problem and perhaps come up with some new ways of thinking about it. So think about the race problem. What is the race problem in 2009 in the United States? Well, we could frame it as one of insufficient awareness of racial and ethnic differences. Right? We could look at a post-apartheid society, it's a way to describe the United States. We have left behind legal segregation. We are in a civil rights era. But one could say that even with the end of formal legal apartheid in the United States, that people still lack understanding and knowledge of others in other racial and ethnic categories. Now, if that were the way to think about the problem, as a lack of awareness, a lack of knowledge, then the appropriate response might be multiculturalism, diversity, thinking about how to educate. The answer might lie in conversation. Now, I think in some ways that's accurate. There certainly is not enough awareness and knowledge between groups in the United States, especially a lack of knowledge and awareness among folks in the dominant group, the white group. And conversation is always a good thing. I have nothing against conversation. But the question is, does that framework of multiculturalism and diversity get us to the core of the problem? And here's where I want to suggest we use some different language. Instead of a generic-sounding race problem, let's move to what the real problem around race is still today in 2009, which is racism. And here, I want to ask what may seem like a simple and even obvious question. Where does racism come from? From what roots does racism arise? And I think that question also is simple to answer. It comes from white supremacy. Right? the idea that non-white people are inherently inferior in intellectual or moral terms from white folks. Right? That's what we call white supremacy. Now, let's ask a simple question. Who came up with the idea of white supremacy? Did black and brown people come up with the idea that they were inherently inferior to white people? No, I don't think so. That's a notion that comes from the white community. Now, when we talk about the modern conception of racism and white supremacy, we're talking about an idea that comes out of Europe about 500 to 600 years ago. Right? It comes out of Europe just about the time Europe was doing what? Going about the business of subjugating the rest of the world, especially those parts of the world that were not white. So we can see that the core problem is not some abstract race problem, but the problem of white supremacy. We can see where white supremacy comes from. It comes from white folks. So while DuBois was, obviously he was right in having to confront the way that the society he lived in saw him as a problem, he also understood that he wasn't the problem. And in fact, that question, how does it feel to be a problem, should have been turned onto the white people in his world. In other words, instead of white people asking DuBois, how does it feel to be a problem, he should have been asking them, how does it feel to be a problem, because the idea of white supremacy comes out of their community, out of their world. So white people created a white supremacist society, and therefore, by definition, white people are the root of the problem. Now, that was a century ago. And the question is, what about today? How do we deal with these same questions today? How do we, first of all, describe the United States today? And I'm going to make the argument that it's best to describe the United States today, still, as a white supremacist society. Again, even in a post-apartheid civil rights era, in which the legal structures of discrimination have been eliminated, I'm going to argue it's still appropriate to talk about the United States as a white supremacist society. What do I mean by that? Because that, as you are well aware, is not a claim that goes over easy in the United States. Go out into the world, make that claim, and you'll get a lot of pushback, yes? Okay. So what do I mean by it? I'm going to argue that the United States is a white supremacist society in both material and ideological terms. Okay, let's take those one at a time. The United States is a white supremacist society in material terms. What do I mean by that? If you look at the data that's available on what I would call measures of wealth and well-being, the data that tells you how well people are doing in a society, things like income, college graduation, right? Household wealth, infant mortality, access to health care. All of those things are rough measures of how well people are doing in society. And what you find if you look at the data in the United States today is that there is a racialized gap between white and non-white America generally. That is, on average, white people are doing better than non-white people across the board. That gap is particularly pronounced between white and black America, and there's a lot of data on that. So let's take a minute and recognize that the problem is not only a racialized gap between white and black America, but the fact that that gap is narrowing at an extremely slow pace. So if you look at the data from the immediate aftermath of the civil rights movement, the late 60s, early 70s, you look at that racialized gap between white and black America then and compare it to the gap today, and what you find is on some of those measures of wealth and well-being, the gap is as wide today as it was 40 years ago. On the measures in which that gap is narrowing, it's narrowing at such a glacial pace that it will be decades, or in some cases even centuries, before the gap is closed, before we achieve parity, before we achieve a rough equality in society. So in material terms, that racialized gap not only exists, but it is not closing. Okay. So remember a couple of things. The United States is the most affluent society in the history of the world. There has never been a society in the history of this planet that is as affluent, as wealthy as the United States. And if you think about it, we have, Americans take pride in being able to do anything, right? That's sort of the national character we would assert. If Americans want to get something done, what do we do? What do we do when we want to get something done? We roll up our sleeves and we do it, right? That's what Americans do. Okay, so there's this sense that we can accomplish whatever we set our minds to. And we are the most affluent society in the history of the world. If the United States, in the space of 40 years, wanted to close the racialized gap between white and non-white America, could it do it? It certainly has the resources. It certainly has the belief in its ability to accomplish such things. Yet it hasn't closed that gap. What does that tell you? Well, what it tells me is that it is still appropriate to call the United States a white supremacist society in material terms. All right. I also said that I think it's appropriate to call the United States a white supremacist society in ideological terms, not only in the material reality of the world, but the reality of how we think. So what do I mean by that? Well, one piece of evidence might be the course catalog of the University of Texas at Austin. If you open that course catalog, what do you see reflected? Do you really see reflected an equal valuing of knowledge from all parts of the world and all people in the world? Or do you see a valuing of the knowledge that comes out of Europe, out of white, Northern Europe especially? In other words, what's reflected in the way in which we educate our young people? It's a reflection, I think, of the belief still that what came out of Europe, the politics, the art, the culture, is still superior to that knowledge that comes from the rest of the world. That's one measure. But it goes beyond that. That might be an institutional feature. There's also a kind of unconscious way we think that can be revealed in research. So, for instance, take the research that is done on hiring practices. In the contemporary United States, no employer would stand up and say, I am racist in my hiring practices, correct? Not only would it be illegal, it's socially unacceptable. Yet there is research that demonstrates that in hiring practices, a persistent discrimination exists. There have been a number of studies, for instance, that construct roughly equivalent resumes. You take one resume, give it a certain level of education, work experience, etc. Another resume constructed equivalently, and you change only one thing. On the first resume, you give it a traditionally white-sounding name, like, I don't know, Bob Jensen. And before you heard my name, what was the assumption, before you saw me and you heard my name, what was the assumption of my race based on my name, Bob Jensen? Did anybody wonder about that? No, it's a white-sounding name. If you had heard my name, Jamal Washington, what assumption would you have made? Probably that it was African American. In other words, there are names that code race. So in this particular study, researchers constructed equivalent resumes, put a white-sounding name on one, a black-sounding name on the other, and sent them to real employers who were advertising for employees. And what they found was interesting, that the callback rate, right, the number of calls that each resume received, remember roughly equivalent resumes, the callback rate for the white name was significantly higher than the callback rate for the black name. Was that because the human resources manager who was making a decision about who to call back was making overtly racist decisions? Probably not. It was an unconscious reflection of the way many of us still think in the white community. Okay? There are a lot of studies like this. There was a study recently done in which people were shown videotape of neighborhoods and asked to evaluate the quality of the neighborhood. Right? Would you want to live there, basically? And the video was always of the same physical space, the same neighborhood. The only thing that changed were the people who were walking in the video. So some were white only, some were people from different racial backgrounds, and some were non-white only. And what was revealed in that study is that the evaluations of the quality of the neighborhood depended on the racial composition of the people in the video. Right? And that's an indication of how there's still an unconscious white supremacy. The way we think, not necessarily what we say out loud, but the reality of the way we think. So if you look at the material reality of the United States, if you look at the ideological reality, I would argue it's still appropriate to call the United States a white supremacist society today. Now, do you think that black and brown people want that state of affairs to continue? No. So if that state of affairs does continue, it is the product of the actions or inaction of predominantly the white community. Which means, I think, that we can still recognize that the color of the race problem, just as much as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 21st century, the color of the race problem is still white. Which means that the question is still, for those of us who are white, how does it feel to be a problem? Flipping DuBois's question and asking us from the dominant community, from the white community, to ask, how do we feel when we recognize that, in fact, the core of the race problem still resides in the white community? Now, if you take all of that seriously, I think it leads to a recognition that this framework of multiculturalism and diversity is inadequate to deal with the nature of the real problem. Again, diversity is a good thing. Multiculturalism is a good thing. A deeper recognition of the diversity of the world, a greater understanding of all people of different cultures is a good thing. I can't imagine arguing against it. But my point is, it's not enough to deal with the race problem as it really exists. So if everybody agrees that white supremacy is an illusion, that is, the belief that white people are better is an illusion, and if everybody agrees that perpetuating a white supremacist system is fundamentally unethical, that is to say that white people don't deserve to have it better, then a political project is necessary, not just a cultural one. That we have to deal not only with questions of culture, but also questions of politics. Now, by politics, I don't mean the partisan wrangling between people in different parties. I mean politics in the broader sense, the play of power in a culture. Politics, in the end, is about the distribution of power and resources. In other words, it's about stuff. It's about who gets what, who gets the ability to decide, who gets the stuff. And I don't know about you, but my observation is that people generally who have stuff don't like to give it up. Yes? If you have a lot of stuff, most people want to hold on to that stuff. And most people also want to hold on not only to the material comforts of their life, they want to hold on to the idea that they have a right to those material comforts. And so if we're going to deal with this race problem, if we're going to understand it as a problem of white supremacy, still in the 21st century, we're going to have to deal with it not purely as a cultural question, but also as a political question. All right. Now, if you make this argument in the white community, you will get, as I said, a lot of people who push back, right, who will reject this kind of analysis. And one of the things that people will say most quickly is that, okay, I'm white, but I am hardly the master of the universe. I am not one of the elite. How can you claim I have privilege when, in fact, I'm struggling as much as anybody in the world? And I think we have to respond to that because, of course, think about it. White women can point out that job discrimination based on gender still exists, that harassment on the job is still commonplace, and that's real. Right? Working and poor people can point out that they have struggles of their own, and that is real as well. Right? So we can recognize that racial injustice rooted in white supremacy is not the only problem in the world that people struggle with. That it is not the only hierarchical system that creates inequality. We can look at gender and we can look at class and recognize there is inequality rooted in the gender and class system we live with. That means we have to look not only at white supremacy, we have to look at patriarchy, at male dominance. We have to look at capitalism, at the nature of inequality in the economic system we live in. And we also, I think, have to recognize the need to expand our focus beyond the borders of the United States and look at the inequality in the world that's an effect of the nationalism that structures our world. Okay? So what do we do? What do we find when we do that? When we actually look across the board at white supremacy, at patriarchy, at capitalism, at nationalism? Well, one thing I think we see is that there is a similar structure to all of those systems of inequality. Right? So the inequality that exists is a product of the choices of people. I think that's self-evident. That when you have a system based on hierarchy, some people having more than others, that's the product of a set of choices that people have made somewhere along the line. But there's something interesting about that. All of us, no matter what kind of philosophical or theological system we come from, no matter where we root our own values, most of us, in fact the vast majority of us in the world today, come out of a system that is premised on a couple of basic things: the equality of all human beings and the inherent dignity of all people. If we went around the room and I asked each one of you about the grounding of your own moral system, I'm sure each one of you would talk about equality and the inherent dignity of all people, whether you're secular or religious, no matter what tradition you come out of. Okay? So we see that there are systems of hierarchy that distribute wealth and power in profoundly unequal ways. And because people have a commitment to equality and the dignity of all people, there's got to be a way to cope with that. And the way we tend to cope with it historically as human beings is to attempt to naturalize the inequality. In other words, to take a system that was constructed by human choice and say, well, it's actually just the way things are. And if you look across these different hierarchies, you see that's in fact traditionally what people have done. White people have tried to claim that they are naturally smarter than non-white people, leading to that system of a hierarchy. Men have long claimed that they are dominant over women by the nature of sexual differences. Yeah. Wealthy people are constantly trying to remind us that the wealth they have acquired is because of their effort in a system based on human nature, and that system rewards their skill and efforts. And of course, Americans dominate the world in the contemporary period, often arguing that the U.S. system is kind of the final stage of the natural development of societies, and we are on top by virtue of that natural development. So what you see is there's a common structure to the inequality that's produced by these hierarchical systems. It takes systems that are produced by human choices and attempts to naturalize those choices. But in fact, they aren't natural at all. So let's think about them. What about gender? Well, is male dominance a natural product of what it means to be human? I don't think so. You can find lots of societies which have resisted that throughout history. Okay. Is the only way to structure an economy based on the dominance of the wealthy, right, that rewards the kind of greed we see? Is the only way to structure a world system based on the dominance of the United States and similar first world countries? No, I don't think that's the case. I think that those attempts to naturalize that dominance are attempts to cover up the fact that, in fact, these systems are a product of choice. And if we chose one way, we can choose differently. And of course, at the core of all these systems is a violence of some sort, a violence to maintain the inequality. So I think what we have to come to terms with is how do we start to take apart systems in which people with power have attempted to naturalize that power to get us to accept what is otherwise an unacceptable state of affairs. And there's one statistic, I think, that really dramatizes just how unacceptable the state of affairs in the world really is. If you look at statistics from the World Bank, you'll see that approximately half the world's population today, that's more than 3 billion people, half the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day. Half the world's population lives on less than what some folks in the United States spend on a fancy cup of coffee. Right? Now, those people living on less than $2.50 a day are disproportionately female, they're disproportionately non-white, and they live disproportionately in the developing world, the so-called third world. That is, that state of affairs, which is so dramatically in violation of our fundamental principles around equality and the inherent dignity of all people, right, come out of these systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and first world domination of the world. Okay? In other words, what we're saying is we live in a profoundly unjust society that violates the stated moral principles that each one of us would claim to hold. And if we're serious about trying to create a more just society, it seems to me we have to go to the core of the systems that produce the injustice. If the injustice comes out of white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and first world domination, and it seems to me the only thing we can do is to go to the root of the problem and to go to those systems. Right. So I think where I want to conclude before we start the discussion is to go back to DuBois and remember that the problem of the 20th century, he said, was the color line. And to some degree, of course, that was true. But of course, it wasn't the only problem at the beginning of the 20th century. That the problems of patriarchy, the problems of capitalism, the problems of first world domination were as much present then as they are today. So the problem of the color line remains, but it is only one of the problems that we face based on a system of hierarchies that produce the profound injustice we're talking about. And I think what that reminds us is that if we want to solve those problems, we have to go to the root of the hierarchies every bit as much today as we would have had to a century ago. And if you think about the problem of justice in the world today, in the context of the equally compelling problem of sustainability, of the fact that we not only live in this profoundly unjust world, we also live in a fundamentally unsustainable world. That is, the human drawdown of the ecological capital of the planet is going forward at a rate that we cannot continue indefinitely. That you realize that solving the problems of hierarchy, not only the hierarchies within the human species, the way that white supremacy, patriarchy, nationalism, capitalism play out, but also the way in which the human species has tried to dominate the entire planet. That there's not only a profound injustice, there's also a fundamental unsustainability to the nature of these hierarchies. Which means if we don't figure out how to take apart the hierarchies, to construct a different way to live based on a real commitment to those principles of equality and the dignity of all people. If we can't solve that problem, we may not be able to solve the most fundamental problem, which is how to live in harmony with the rest of the living world as well. So we have our hands full. You have your hands full, especially as young people.
You said that, in material terms, like today, that we still have a white supremacy, but how's that white's fault? Did white people tell other races, like, hey, you can't go to college, or how does that work? How's that white's fault?
Okay, all right. So if we can see that historically, the gap in the material wealth of the white versus the non-white community was enforced by law. There were structures in place that kept non-white folks from acquiring the kind of wealth that white people had. In the absence of those legal restraints, how do we assign responsibility to the white community? Well, remember that the way that the wealth and power of a society get distributed is not merely a matter of law. It's a matter of practice as well. And if the practices continue that institutionalize that gap between white and non-white America, the assumption, just by the basis of logic, is that those are being maintained by the white community. Because non-white people do not want to maintain structures that keep them in a subordinated position. It doesn't have to be the product of conscious choices. What we're recognizing now is that we've moved from a system of overt, legalized racism into a system in which both institutional and unconscious racism continue. That is, racism is built into the fabric of the institutions of our society. One obvious example is the way we fund public schools in this country. For the most part, public schools are funded by property taxes. Property taxes, funding a public school system with property taxes means that those property-rich districts will have more resources for education than property-poor districts. Because there's still segregation patterns in housing, and because there's still racialized gaps in wealth between white and non-white communities, it means as a result of that institution, the way we fund public schools, there will continue to be racialized gap in education. That's institutionalized racism. And there's also unconscious racism. Building off of those studies I mentioned, the way in which people will claim a commitment to racial justice, but because we all grew up in a system, in a world structured on white supremacy, those ideas can live in us in ways that are unconscious. I'm 50 years old. I was born in the United States. I was raised in that white supremacist society, and I can still feel the ways that that racist training pulls on me. Right? So I think if we recognize the nature of institutional racism and unconscious racism, we can see how even in a post-civil rights era, that those realities can continue to structure people's opportunities. And as long as that racialized gap in wealth and well-being exists, as long as a society doesn't take measures to close that gap, I think we have to ask, is the society really committed to racial justice in a meaningful way?
You said that America is still currently a white supremacist society.
Mm-hmm.
Can you use an example of equal resumes being given to an employer and significantly the white-sounding name got callbacks or whatever
Mm-hmm.
you said more often? In the fall, on our presidential election, both
Mm-hmm.
those two men had similar resumes. They
Mm-hmm.
were both, senators and all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. If America is still a white supremacist society, how would we elect a black person to lead our country?
Mm-hmm.
Because on that one, the entire country got to basically hire someone to have that job.
Mm-hmm.
If the entire country is white supremacist, how would the black man get that job?
Okay. That's an interesting question because in the aftermath of the election of Barack Obama, it does seem to go against common sense to say the United States is still a white supremacist society. First of all, I think if you look at some of the realities of that campaign and look at the way in which racism was deployed against the Obama candidacy, whatever your own political preference, who you voted for is kind of irrelevant, you can see that, in fact, the race card was played in the campaign, was played by white candidates. It was especially played by Hillary Clinton, right, who used coded appeals to white people, talking about the white working class, actually at one point using the term white. Right. So first of all, we can recognize that in the campaign itself we see the resonance of racist appeals, how they still do work in the culture. Right. We also can recognize that before the economic crisis, Barack Obama was actually at best even with McCain or trailing in the polls. So one can wonder if without the financial meltdown, would the election have gone another way. But even with that, your point is taken, that a significant number of white people in the United States voted for an African American for president. Does that mean that all vestiges of white supremacy have been eliminated? I don't think that squares with the data that we've been talking about that racialized gap. I don't think it squares with the reality of institutionalized forms of racism, nor does it deal with that unconscious racism that might not play out in every single decision. To look for patterns of human behavior is not to say that that pattern plays out in every single interaction. Let me give you another example. There's a common phrase called driving while black or driving while brown, which recognizes the difference between the white population's interaction with law enforcement and the black and Latinos' interaction with law enforcement. That doesn't mean that every time a white cop stops a black person, one is going to know for sure that that's going to play out in a racist fashion. It means there's a pattern, a disproportionate use of force, and even deadly force against people of color, for instance. Right? So we're looking for those patterns. It doesn't mean that every single interaction between white and non-white is going to be sort of saturated with an overt racism. Now, I think the fact is that in the years since the civil rights movement, the white society has been relatively flexible in allowing in to positions of power a certain number of non-white people. Just like in the aftermath of the feminist movement, the system of power allows in a certain number of women to positions of authority. Does that mean that we have transcended the problem of racism, transcended the problem of sexism? I don't think so. I think you have to look at the wider patterns.
I have a question in regards to hegemony and how it's cyclical. You discussed the fact that we see in ideologies and how we're taught in institutions and how we're educated that there's kind of a favoritism towards European ways of thought. And that I personally think that plays into hegemony and how we, and by we I'm referring to non-white individuals, kind of allow these systems of power to continue because, I mean, we play into these materialistic ideals, we continue these thoughts and patterns, and we don't call into, like, question the fact that we're being taught these things and we aren't being taught other things, you know, until you come to college and you maybe make that decision to kind of expand your system of knowledge. So I struggle with how do we fight hegemony and how do we address that, because how can you technically save a group or hope that a group will come into action when they don't know there's a problem where they think it's okay?
That's a very interesting and important point, because I've been talking primarily from the position of someone who's white, who was raised white in a white supremacist society, what it means to step back and reflect critically on that society. You're talking about the fact that people of color grow up in that same white supremacist society. And if I'm reading you right, there's really 2 points you're making. One is that non-white folks have long talked about the problem of internalizing white supremacist values, right? So that you struggle against the way the culture defines you. And that is, in fact, a struggle. The other point, if I'm understanding, is that in an affluent society that has conceded that overt white supremacy is no longer acceptable, as we said, it's a flexible system, and some number of non-white people will achieve relatively high levels of affluence or relatively powerful positions. And how do you stay focused on the nature of the system when you yourself have been able to achieve some of those? Is that what the kind of...
Correct.
Okay. I don't think there's really an answer to that beyond this claim I'm making that we have to stay connected to a political struggle. That it's not enough just to, talk about in kind of vague ways that we're going to value the diversity or that we're going to honor a multicultural society. All of those things are good, but politics is what changes the distribution of wealth and power. Now, in the 1960s, the 50s, and the 60s and the 70s, the struggle against white supremacy had that overtly political cast to it, not only in the form of the civil rights movement, but also in the form of more radical movements that presented a much more direct challenge to the distribution of wealth and power. Most of those movements have receded. So it's probably an insufficient answer, but I think it is in the reconstituting of a political movement, and from my point of view, a political movement with particularly radical goals that can achieve that. But as someone who's white, it's hard for me to sort of say much about what it means to be non-white in a white supremacist culture and how one resists that. Certainly communities of color have resisted it for years and will continue. But it's a seductive society in lots of ways, in part because of the affluence. Right? There's always the lure of material success that this culture holds out. And there is always some percentage of any even subordinated group that can achieve that.
You say we live in a fundamentally unjust world. How do you go about to change that? You say we have to go to the core of the system in order to show injustice. How do you go about that when minorities themselves constantly put each other down?
Again, we see that a white supremacist system not only affects the way white people think, it affects the way non-white people think about themselves, as you pointed out, but as you're pointing out also about how non-white people feel about each other. So one of the real difficult issues, it seems to me, on the table today are conflicts not only between white and non-white, but, as you're pointing out, among non-white groups. I think many of you in the room recognize that, for instance, between the black and Latino communities, there are struggles. That might have been specifically what you're referring to. How do we deal with that? Well, again, this is going to sound like, one-note Bob. Back to the political. Back to the question of how do you create a just distribution of wealth and power? Right? You do it by undermining the hierarchy at the core. Right? You don't do it by struggling with some other marginalized group for a share of the pie, because that pie is always controlled by people with greater power and a disproportionate share of the wealth than you. Right? So it's kind of a common principle that people in power try to divide and conquer. It's one of the great lessons of history. That the very small number of people who tend to control a society that's based on hierarchy will always try to keep others apart and divided, instead of the others seeing their common interest in opposing that very concentrated power. Right? That's the story of racial struggles in the United States. It's not only the story of struggles between non-white groups, it's also partly the story of how poor and working white people have been, in a sense, conned by white supremacy into believing that their interests lie with the white elite rather than lying with other ordinary people struggling against that elite. Now, how do you do that? Well, you do it, first of all, I think, by telling the truth about the nature of the society we live in. And from there, those political movements can be built. But I think it's a real struggle. So take the split between the African American and the Latino community. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything when we recognize that's a lot about immigration, yes? The belief that the immigration from Latin America will somehow undermine the already tenuous position of black people in the United States. Those are the kinds of things that we've got to solve by coming together rather than allowing the power structure to keep us apart.
You said, the answer to that, coming together, but how can we come together if everybody keeps on pointing fingers at everybody else? Why can't we just say, hey, the past is the past, and what can we do to fix it, instead of saying, oh, it's this guy's fault, and we need to do this to fix this, and why does everybody keep on pointing fingers?
Well, I think that there is no way to create a better society without recognizing where we sit at the moment. And there's no way to understand where we sit at the moment without understanding where we came from. So, in fact, people are always dealing with the past and trying to come to terms with the past. And people are always pointing fingers, if by pointing fingers we mean assessing who's responsible for a system. And I don't know how you can fix a system without knowing that. Right? So to say that we should somehow wipe the slate clean is to say that we should abandon the knowledge that can make it possible to analyze the system and change it. In any system where there is injustice, the obligation lies squarely on people who have the disproportionate wealth and power in a society. That is, if you're trying to fix a problem, right, it is first and foremost the obligation of people who benefit from that injustice. And that means white people in the question of racial justice. It means men in the question of gender justice. It means the wealthy and the elite in the question of economic inequality. It means those of us who live in the United States in the question of the disproportionate distribution of resources around the world. We're the ones who have that obligation. Right? Now, that's not pointing fingers, that's taking responsibility. And I think that's where we start. To me, that doesn't have to be based in recrimination or blame. It's an honest assessment of the nature of the world we live in and how it came to be that way. And I can't imagine how to go forward without that.
I just had two comments. One to address what you said. I don't think that it's about blame, but I think it's about actual recognition that something was done. Because as a black woman, you struggle with the fact that you feel pride in who you are and where you come from, but there's constant reinforcement of a culture that's not something that you should be proud of. So there's a lot of pain that's rooted in a lot of our history. Slavery was by no means an easy feat, and it's not something that just happened. A lot of people were killed. That's a lot of the roots of a lot of people in this country. I'm an immigrant. I'm from the African diaspora, but I identify with their struggle. So I think it's just about recognition that it happened and taking blame. And I think that's kind of the step where you can say, okay, let's move on. But before that happens, I think that there will always be the pointing and the blaming, because I don't feel like there was ever kind of like an ownership of what happened and like, yes, this was our fault. It's like you hear rhetoric of, well, the best thing that happens to African Americans was what they were brought to the United States. Well, have you thought about the fact that the best thing that happened to the United States was that there was African slavery? Like, we don't think of it in terms like that. There was a lot of struggle there. So I think just recognizing that really, I think, will go farther. And I'm not by no means in saying that I want someone to say, I'm sorry, Marjorie, for what happened. But just a simple recognition that it did happen and that there is blame somewhere, because, I mean, the argument can be made that, we were sold by our own people, but at the same time, I don't think anyone chose slavery. They didn't choose to be treated as an animal or cattle or anything like that. They were put in that position by force. And just another question, in terms of, I think you mentioned undermining the system. Well, how do we do that when technically at the head of the system, or kind of like the picture of the system, is a person of color, i.e. President Barack Obama? I think it would be a lot more difficult for people to see that change is necessary. And I hate to use that word because it becomes sort of like just a political phrase, but I think it's difficult for people to really recognize that something needs to be done when they feel like we finally come to a place where we have a black president. And how do you communicate to people that there's still change to be made, even though there is a black president, without necessarily undermining the fact that there is a black president?
Yeah. Well, maybe we can wind up here. It's a good place, actually, I think, to conclude. On the one hand, let's go back to the question of blame. I think that the United States has acknowledged, in many ways, its history. Right? The fact that the United States as a country was formed by the nearly complete extermination of indigenous people. We've at least acknowledged that genocide against indigenous people happened. We've acknowledged that slavery was part of the economic engine that propelled the United States into the industrial world. Right? I think what has happened, though, is we want to move from acknowledgement to acceptance, skipping over the accountability that's necessary to make real acceptance possible. And so, rather than use the term blame, I would use the term accountability. Right? Anytime there is injustice, whether it's in the world at the level of societies or in interpersonal relationships at the level of the individual, there's got to be accountability for our own actions. And I think that if a society tries to move too quickly from mere acknowledgement to acceptance and skips over accountability, it will be unable to actually change the nature of the system and produce a really just world. Okay? Now, that's always going to go forward in a very complex reality, as we recognize. It's a country that has made great strides to the point where a person of African descent has been elected to the highest office in the land. And the people I know who were part of the civil rights movement and retain the radical agenda of that movement are the first to acknowledge that we should mark that, because that election of an African American president was in fact made possible by those struggles of previous generations. And to not honor that would be to trivialize those struggles and those sacrifices that people made. But those same people who come out of that civil rights movement are also just as quick to recognize that the real radical goals of the civil rights movement have yet to be met. And that's a world in which there is some rough equality in the distribution of power and resources. That is, a world in which ordinary people feel like they do have a meaningful role in the formation of public policy, in democracy, and that there is a distribution of resources roughly equal so that all people have a chance at a decent life. And the civil rights movement, just like the feminist movement, just like the anti-imperialist movement, all of those were not just about creating a more colorful array of people at the top of society. They were not just about having a few women in positions of power. They were about fundamentally changing that distribution of power and resources. And until we have achieved that, I think the promise of the civil rights movement, the promise of feminism, are still to be achieved. And that's the goal in the end. The real equality that makes it possible for everybody on the planet to live a decent life. And the fact that we are so far from that, it seems to me, should motivate us not to be satisfied with the accomplishments that have been achieved to date, but to press ourselves to go further, to achieve what we all claim in our own philosophical and theological systems to want, which is a world of equality, a world in which the dignity of all people is made real.
Everyone knew she was gonna be fast. Everyone said they could build her to last. 10,000 tons of hurtling steel, screaming around the curve, nobody at the wheel. Everyone